essentially an erosion as the world reserve currency. Give us the highlights of Bretton Woods in the last 70 or so years. So Bretton Woods, and then we created this new type of instrument, fiat, somewhere in this transition, and the petrodollar, and now here we are today with the U.S. still as the least bad money, I guess. At least that seems to be what global consensus seems to think. So give us the spark notes for the last 70 years or so.
Sure. So with World War One and World War Two, you had almost every country rug pull its money. And basically, they all broke their gold pegs. They either just ended gold redeemability altogether, or they did it at a sharply devalued rate. They limited the ability of their own citizens to have gold. America literally outlawed gold ownership for 40 years, from the mid-1930s to the mid-1940s. Basically, their ledger was so bad that they said you can't fall back on this like benign yellow metal as your ledger instead. It was actually, but it was hard to enforce, and so they'd have these big penalties, like years in prison. But they didn't go door to door getting the gold because that would have been like suicide. And so so the interwar era, basically it's just like rug pulls everywhere. Like basically, it was like, and if you lost the war, you hyperinflated. If you won the war, you merely maybe cut your currency in half, for example. And so Switzerland, which tried to stay neutral, they might have lost maybe a third of their currency value. Even Switzerland did a rug pull. They just did like the least bad one. And so after this period, you had invention of the radio. You had further increased global communication. You had the United States emerge as a hyperpower, because Europe was devastated, Japan was devastated, China was devastated, Russia was badly hurt, Soviet Union. And so the United States was this like hyperpower. The only real other pole out there was the Soviet Union. And so when the countries got together in 1944 to decide what are we going to do with our like broken money system after this war ends, the United States' vision won out, which was they said, okay, we're going to keep our dollar backed by gold. It's a devalued rate compared to pre-war, but we're going to keep this current rate. It's illegal for Americans to own it, but a foreign central bank can redeem a dollar for gold because that's the only thing that gives it international credibility. And so we're going to hold the system. And they got people to go along with it because they said, well, do you want like financing to rebuild after the war? Then go with our system.
And that was Bretton
right?
Woods.
And that was Bretton Woods. Yeah, Bretton Woods and the Marshall Plan and all that. There are all these arrangements to have this new system, rebuild allies, even rebuild former enemies, and coalesce the system around the United States. There's also the creation of the World Bank and the IMF. These were kind of like enforcers and guardrails and enticers of the system. They can offer loans. If you need dollar financing, they could provide it, but you had to agree to their terms. And so all this kind of financial infrastructure was set up, and the United States was in a position to do it because they had achieved this centralized hyperpower status. And that, a lot of people blame Nixon for defaulting on the system in 1971. But one thing I point out in the book is that it was broken before then. The implementation itself was flawed because so the Treasury held all the gold. Banks made lending decisions not based on how much gold was in the Treasury's vault. They made lending decisions for any number of reasons. It's fractional reserve banking. And you had the U.S. and other governments running deficits. And so, say from 1950 to 1970, you had U.S.-based money supply double. You had U.S. broad money supply triple. You had offshore lending further multiplying dollars with fractional reserve banking. And all of these dollars were redeemable for gold. And so once they ended these controls on foreign exchange transactions in like 1958, American gold reserves just went straight down because the number of dollars was exponentially upward. And the U.S. only had 20,000 tons of gold. And so anybody with any sense would just take dollars and go redeem it for gold. And so gold reserves just went straight down from 20,000 to 9,000 in like 12 years, just straight down. Given another decade, they would have been completely depleted. And so when 1971 came along, Nixon's watching this like just train wreck happening, and so they default on it. It's like the world's biggest rug pull. They say
didn't he default on it in the middle of a French battleship going to Fort Knox to pick up gold? Like the ship was on the way, and Nixon was like, "No, we're closing it."
That's basically how it was going. So, what the U.S. had a lot. So basically, any country that would try to redeem it too quickly, the United States would be like, "Bro, like." Do you like if you keep withdrawing our gold, we're going to do things like we're going to not have our military base in your country, and then you got to worry about the Soviets, right? So it's like countries didn't want to kind of piss off the U.S. too much, Um, but there was still, but around the margins, it was bad enough that they were still doing it, and the French in particular were more adamant about getting their gold back quickly. And eventually, it got then the UK was jumping on board. Like if there's blood in the water, everybody's going to go in, right? So once you realize someone else is doing it, you realize like, wait, I got to get in there before you don't want to be the last one that didn't redeem any gold. And so once it started to spiral, Nixon comes out and they always he framed it as temporary. He's like, we're temporarily ending, gold redeemability. And he used like false blame. So it's like you blaming speculators, right? It's like, well, the real problem is that dollars are going, exponentially upward, and American gold reserves are going down because you have fractional reserve banking built on a gold peg with no method to slow down the growth of dollars relative to gold. So it's just inherently flawed design. It broke. And then the world found itself in a situation it had never seen itself in before, which is, other than Switzerland, there's like nobody on the gold standard anymore. And any country can kind of force, especially in this modern era, they have technology and power to kind of enforce a ledger in their local jurisdiction. But how do you trade with another country? Like how does Thailand trade with Canada if either of them can just print as much money as they want, right? Why would Canadians trust Thai currency? Why would Thai trust Canadian currency? You can just, you wouldn't want to hold that. And so the United States had to try to find a way to kind of fix this situation. So they already rug pulled everyone, but it's like, can we regain confidence? Can we stabilize this? And so the way they did it was, one is they still had the leading network effect militarily and economically. So they're still by far the biggest, most liquid, deepest capital markets, most power projection capabilities by far. And so they would go to Middle Eastern countries like Saudi Arabia, and they would start trying to kind of maintain this network effect. So they would say to Saudi Arabia, look, you've got your adversary Iran, you've got problems out there. We will sell you arms, and we will, we have aircraft carriers. We can help you defend your territory should we need to. In exchange, you sell us oil. And in fact, whenever you sell oil globally, only sell it in dollars, and then take those dollar surpluses you'll earn and invest most of them in U.S. Treasuries. And for our side, we will have positive real interest rates. We will, slow down the growth of the dollar. We're going to stabilize this. And so it's like, we'll scratch your back if you scratch ours. And so the U.S. was able to diplomatically, militarily reestablish its network effect before it really lost it. And part of that also is that there were a lot of offshore dollars already from the Bretton Woods era, from the Marshall Plan, from all these different things. And one thing to keep in mind is that whenever you owe debt in something, you have demand for that currency. So if I owe like $1,000 in debt, whether or not I like dollars, I have to find a way to get dollars specifically because my debts are contractually denominated in dollars.
Taxes are another great example of that, right?
Yeah, taxes and debts. These are ways to enforce demand for a currency, even if that currency is not particularly desirable. And so part of why the U.S. was able to maintain that network effect is there was existing dollar-denominated debt in the world. And the unintuitive thing is that most of it's not even owed to the U.S., right? So the UK can lend dollars to Argentina, for example, and it's owed in dollars, even though America is not involved, just because it's the global reserve currency. And so the combination of the existing network effect, the depth of American capital markets, military, economy, the existing dollar-denominated debts, and then the fact that they were able to basically, in some ways, back the dollar by oil. So any country, if you hold dollars as reserves, you can go buy oil with it from any of these OPEC producers, or most of these OPEC producers. And so they reestablished the network effect as the most liquid, most saleable, most widely recognized currency, and they've been able to maintain that for decades. The main drawback of that design, so the Bretton Woods drawback was that gold kept depleting as dollars grew exponentially. The main drawback of the current like petrodollar, eurodollar system is that the whole world needs dollars. They have to service their debts, and they hold it as reserves, and they buy commodities and do international trade in dollars primarily. So the whole world has this kind of extra demand for dollars. And so the U.S. has to supply the world with dollars. And the way we do that is through structural trade deficits. And it actually kind of happens organically because there's all this extra demand for dollars, which, most currencies, if you run a trade deficit for a long time, eventually you're going to run into all sorts of credit issues and your currency is going to weaken, and that's going to make your exports more competitiveness, and it's going to damage your import power. So trade balances have a way of kind of balancing themselves out after a while. But the United States, because of this network effect, there's all this like extra demand for dollars. It increases our import power. It reduces our export competitiveness. So it's cheaper to make things